Hey guys, hello. What is going on? So, I am really excited about a discussion that I want to have with you all today. I know that some of you got the notifications, and I sent out a little inquiry earlier to see who would be interested in having this conversation with me. Um, I heard about it during a Black History discussion that I sat a part of. Hey, Sister Zuba. And there was so much information and knowledge that was shared with me that I wanted to take this opportunity to have this discussion with you guys. So I am going to wait a couple of minutes before I get started to give those that said that they were interested an opportunity to actually get the notification and know that I'm live. This is a wonderful discussion. If you feel like it, please share this on your page. I do believe that it's going to be very enlightening. It is going to be very educational. And I am definitely looking forward to just having dialogue about this discussion. Because, of course, it's Black History Month, but we don't oftentimes talk about things that can be a little bit more engaging, things that can be a little bit not really controversial, but at the same time, I think this topic can be a little controversial to some audiences. But again, if you know anything about me, you know that I am a nerd when it comes to information. And the beauty about the conversation that we're having today is not only are we talking about something that we know was experienced in history, but it's also something that many people are experiencing present day. But what we don't talk about is the trauma of some of those experiences. And so that is going to be a lot of what we're going to discuss today. So, like I said, take a minute and share this on your page. I want to give those just another opportunity to hop on. I will wait to the 5 minute mark. So, in about a minute, I will actually get started with my discussion. Again, I'm really excited. And as I go through my discussion, move my screen over a little bit. If you have questions, if there's anything that comes to mind, I want this to be a dialogue. I do see the chat. And so, again, if there's anything that comes up that I am discussing that you feel is beneficial or you want to add to the discussion, by all means. I am not I don't know everything when it comes to our topic for today, but I did spend some time listening to others who are a little bit more educated in the area. And I got just a lot of great information from their discussions, provide you with a couple of resources. And we just gonna hang out for a little bit. And I promise, I say this all the time, but I am going to do better with going live. I know that I don't do it all the time. but I always enjoy it when I do. So, gonna do better to go live. Okay. All right. Chew up my cough drop because we are right here at the 5 minute mark, and I do want to get started because it is a lot of information. All right. So, our topic for today, it is entitled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And as I stated, when I kind of asked about if people wanted to have this discussion, some of you may have heard this term before, but you may have not ever heard it. It's not necessarily a term that you will find in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. You won't find it in there. But this is actually a term that was coined by a Black author. She's also a researcher. And I will tell you a little bit more about her in just a little bit. But why are we having this discussion? As I stated, I participated in a discussion for Black history with my job, and the gentleman did an amazing he did such an amazing job just giving us a history of Black Americans as it relates to military, because I work for the VA full time. And so I wanted to be able to bring that information to a different platform, because again, the information that he provided was so rich, it was so powerful. And so he gave us this term, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and it immediately resonated with a lot of different things that we see today. We don't necessarily call it, post-traumatic slave syndrome or PTSS, but we see it every day. And I want to go back to the beginning of where slavery kind of began, and we'll do a historical walkthrough of some of those experiences. We will look at the implications of slavery then, but we'll also look at some of the more prominent aspects of slavery. But again, a lot of times, although it's no longer called a certain thing, doesn't necessarily mean that those institutions and those systems no longer exist. Okay. So let's do a little bit of a historical walkthrough of slavery. And this is even prior to when we talk about the slavery in a sense that we typically would read about in our history books as it relates to Black Americans. So 6800 BC, the world's first city emerges in Mesopotamia. Land ownership in the early stages of technology bring war in which enemies are captured and forced to work in slavery. So this is BC. 2575 BC, temple art celebrates the capture of slaves in battle. Egyptians capture slaves by sending special expeditions up the Nile River. And if you are a Bible scholar, you know that there was a large part of that history, where Moses was sent to set the people free, the children of Israel. Well, they were in captivity, they were in slavery. And so he was on assignment to go and set the people free from the Egyptians, right? Because remember, he had to go to Pharaoh multiple times and he was like, hey, bro, let my people go. But again, they were in slavery. 5500 BC, the city-state of Athens used as many as 30,000 slaves in its silver mines. So we're talking about an ancient empire that was known to have 30,000 slaves. So 1200 AD, the Roman military campaigns captured slaves by the thousands. Some estimate the population of Rome is more than half slaves. 500 AD, Anglo-Saxons enslaved the native Britons after invading England. 1000. Slavery is a normal practice in England's rural agricultural economy as destitute workers place themselves and their families in a form of debt bondage to the landowners. 1380. In the aftermath of the Black Plague, Europe's slave trade thrives in response to a labor shortage. Slaves pour in from all over the continent, the Middle East, and North Africa. 1444. Portuguese traders bring the first large cargo of slaves from West Africa to Europe by sea. This was the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And I know that many of you, is when we talk about slavery, this is typically where we begin to become aware, or this is typically where we know about history as it relates to slavery, is beginning with the Atlantic slave trade. Now, again, like I stated, slavery goes all the way. The earliest documentation of slavery is all the way in 6800 BC. 1526. Spanish explorers bring the first African slave to settlements in what would become the United States. The first African American stage, the first known slave revolt in the Americas. So again, that's 1526. 1550. Slaves are depicted as objects of conspicuous consumption in much of Renaissance art. Did you know that in Renaissance art, that slaves were depicted as objects? Like, that may be something you didn't know. Like I said, a lot of this is educational. I learned a lot as I was doing some research, and so I hope this information is enlightening to you as much as it was to me. 1641. Massachusetts becomes the first British colony to legalize slavery. Okay. So I'm going to go over just a little bit more of historical information. And I feel that the history of some of this makes sense because, again, sometimes when we were in school, there were certain parts of our history that was omitted. There were certain parts of our history that may have been twisted. And so I try to go to credible resources to gather information that may not be as common. Okay. So inland tribes in Africa, such as the Igbo, were regularly raided by their power coastal neighbors, and the captives led away to be sold as slaves. So this lets us know that the Igbo tribe, if they were regularly raided by their neighbors, that means these were other Africans. These were other people who were also of African descent who raided them. But wait a minute, it said that they were sold as slaves. Did you know that the early slave trade was that by Africans themselves, right? This says that it was early, there was their neighbors, right? So this is early slave trade. European merchants who came to buy slaves in West Africa were confined by rulers in these countries to a few coastal ports. So that means that the rulers in those nations, the kings, whoever was in authority, they had those areas landlocked. So they only gave the Europeans access to certain parts of the continent where Africans could bring slaves and trade as cartel. So other Africans had the ability to now bring people that they had enslaved to trade as cartel in order to get higher prices. Hundreds of miles farther south in the Portuguese colony of Angola, hundreds of thousands of Africans likewise carried out the initial captures. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Again, when we talk about slavery, typically we talk about how the Europeans came and captured Africans. That wasn't the beginning of slavery. Down south in a Portuguese colony of Angola, hundreds of thousands of Africans were likewise captured initially and enslaved. And that is where the slave trading process actually began. They began funneling slaves to other countries, funding the slaves. Sorry, my screens are divided. into the major marketplaces where the Portuguese took charge of them and shipped them off to Brazil. Most of the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were purchased rather than captured by Europeans. I'm going to say that again. This says that most of the slaves that were shipped across the Atlantic, they were actually purchased. Again, now I just stated that they were brought to these ports by other Africans. They had been conquered, they had been bought, whatever the case may be. The Africans that were shipped were not captured. So it wasn't the picture that we typically see when we when we watch Roots and you have the white Americans coming ashore and they're like running and capturing the slaves. Now that's a part of it. But again, the majority of the initial slaves, they were not captured, they were bought. So that means that somebody else had already done the capturing, which, and like I stated, it was other Africans. Here's something else that I didn't know. They were also captured by the Arabics, the Arabs. Arabs, however, captured their own slaves and they penetrated far deeper into Africa than the Europeans dared venture. That's something I didn't know. I didn't know that the Arabic nation was a part of this initial slave trade. And again, it states that they were a little bit more brave. So they decided to go further south than even the Europeans did. Over the century, untold millions of human beings from sub-Saharan Africa were transported into captivity to other parts of the world. No exact statistics exist covering all the sources and all the destinations, and scholarly estimates vary. However, over the centuries, somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 million people were shipped across the Atlantic as slaves, and another 14 million African slaves were sent to the Islamic nations of the Middle East and North Africa. On both routes, of course, we know that many died in transit. The horrors of the Atlantic voyage and packed and suffocating slave ships, together with exposure to new diseases from the Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of the actual slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels. In the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced, here's something I didn't know, they were forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara. So this destination, this journey, the death toll was twice as high. Again, a lot of history books only tell about the journey of the slaves in ships across the Atlantic. But here's another journey of the slaves that we don't really talk about, or at least I didn't know. And many of you may not have known this information as well, but slaves were forced to walk across the Sahara Desert. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. In 1849, a letter from the Ottoman official referred to 1,600 Black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. So the prime destination of the African slave trade to the Islamic world was Istanbul, which is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the largest and busiest slave market flourished. There, women were paraded, examined, questioned, and bid on in a public display, often witnessed by visiting foreigners, until it was finally closed down in 1847. And the slave trade in Istanbul moved underground. In other Islamic countries, however, the slave markets remained open and public, both to natives and foreigners. This market functioned until about 1873, when two British cruisers appeared offshore, followed by an ultimatum from Britain that the Zanzibar slave trade must cease, or the island would face a full naval blockade. And I know I'm giving you a lot of information, but I just want to give you the historical background, and then we're going to really get into some good stuff. From as early as the 17th century, most Negroes in the American colonies were actually born on American soil. This was the only plantation society in the Western Hemisphere in which the African population consistently maintained its numbers without continual large scale importations of slavery from Africa, and in which the population grew by natural increase. By contrast, Brazil, over the centuries, imported 6 times as many slaves as the United States. Did you know that? Let me say that one more time. By contrast, Brazil, that country imported 6 times as many slaves as the United States, even though the US had a larger resident slave population than Brazil. 30% of all slaves in the Western Hemisphere, as compared to 31% in Brazil. Even such Caribbean islands as Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and others imported more slaves than the United States. So here is where we get to talk a little bit more about some of the traumas of slavery. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Let's look at kind of what, when we look at trauma and we're talking about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, I want you to have a couple of definitions working concurrently as we go through this discussion. So we're talking about a group of people being traumatized by an experience. So how is it that me, present day, or any other person of African descent, how is it that they could possibly be traumatized by an experience that they were not a part of? So when we talk about trauma, trauma is oftentimes engrafted within us, right? It affects the brain. The part of the brain that is implicated in the stress response includes the amygdala, it includes the hippocampus, and it includes the prefrontal cortex. Traumatic stress can be associated with lasting changes in the brain areas. So let's talk about that for a second. So we're talking about a group of people who experienced slavery to a magnitude that none of us probably can really comprehend or be able to even conceptualize and wrap our minds around. So if our ancestors experienced trauma, and this tells us that trauma in such a capacity, it affects the structure of the brain. So before slavery, their brain structured the way that they thought, the way that they processed, the things that were now engrafted in their overall DNA, it has now been changed by that traumatic experience. And so those changes, as they adapted, they now produce more generations who, although didn't experience the trauma, because of how it affects the structuring of the brain, they now think like a person who's experienced the trauma. They behave like a person that has experienced the trauma because it has been engrafted in their DNA. They're not able to see things as if the trauma never existed because of what was passed down from generation to generation. And we're going to talk a little bit in just a minute about transgenerational trauma. And that's where this part is going to make sense. But I need you to understand just for a moment that just because you weren't present when something happened doesn't mean that you're not impacted and affected. Even if you were not a person that experienced slavery, but you have ancestors who did, you think about your great great grandmother and the way that she maybe carried herself. If your great grandmother or anybody that you can point down to in your genealogy experienced trauma, as it relates to slavery, everything that they now did was through that lens. Everything that they did was through the lens of trauma, how they parented, how they interacted with others, how they worked, the skills that they had, all of that leads back to the implications of trauma. And again, those things were passed down from generation to generation. So let's have a real discussion. What were those experiences during slavery? So let's go back. Number one, you have a people who initially was betrayed by your own. Because, like I said at the very beginning, the initial slave trade was not necessarily at the hands of those that came from Western Europe. It was at the hands of those who lived at the country next door. So it was other Africans who found that this trade was lucrative. So they would now go and capture their neighbors, right? They would go to the next country and they would enslave them and they would then sell them. So not only is it that, okay, you're my enemy, but you're now kind of selling me out, which is where that term really comes from. Like, you are sold out, right? When somebody like snitches on you, or you sold out, that is where that comes from, because they were captured by somebody that looks like them, but then sold into the slave trade. So that's one of the first things. Two, you are out minding your own business. And by whatever means, you are captured and taken from everything that you know. You've been now removed from the country of your birth. You've now been placed on a ship, and you may not be captured with those who are part of your family, because a lot of times it wasn't that they went in and captured a whole village. You may have been sent out to go and gather dinner. You may have been sent out to do whatever, and you never made it back home. So now you are in a place that you know nothing of. You don't understand the language of the people that are around you. I can only imagine that that had to have been traumatizing in some capacity. Okay, so once they're now to the destination, wherever they're going, right? So you've been captured. You're now enduring these really harsh conditions. We know that them being on ships was not a pleasant experience. It wasn't a Royal Caribbean cruise, right? They were shackled ankles and feet. They may or may not have had food. They were exposed to diseases. And so now they just have a lot of these experiences. And they didn't park the ship when people died. Either they kept them shackled. So now you have been removed from your country, and you may now be forced to be shackled to somebody who, besides you, is dead and rotting away. That was their experience. If not that, they may would take them and throw them overboard. And we know that many of the Africans, because they were unable to withstand that experience, many of them did. There was like, you know what? Death has to be better than this. And so many of them would jump overboard because it was just too traumatic of an experience. So for those of you that are hopping on, you really got to go back when you get a second and just catch some of the history of slavery, which is what I started with. But now I am talking about just some of the traumatic experiences that those who were enslaved endured. And so this is definitely a dialogue. It's a conversation. If you have thoughts, please add to the discussion. I do have the chat available. So I would love for this to be a dialogue if you would like to add. So we're talking about, again, what were the experience of slaves that may have been so engrafted that it changed the way that their brains were even structured. So now they make it to America or wherever it is that they're going. They're taken off of the ship, and then many of them were immediately sold. And so what if you were with your family by happenstance this entire journey, and then now they immediately separate you? So you are being ripped apart from your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, whoever it is that made this journey with you. And now you are with people that you don't know. And again, you don't speak the language. So you're on a plantation. We'll use that as our base of where the people were sent once they made it to land. We know that the slave experience was brutal. Again, talking about, you've been ripped away from your family and now you are expected to work, from sun up to sundown in really harsh conditions. And if you didn't do things to the level that your slave owner, your slave master felt was satisfactory, we know that they were beaten. And so you're getting, and not just, a slap on the wrist. No, they were beaten to where they had, marks on their back. The flesh was being ripped off of them. They were punished severely. So that we know is psychologically damaging. And they did it publicly because they wanted to make an example of, this is what's going to happen with you. This is what will happen if you disobey. This is what will happen if you don't do what we tell you to do. So you watching somebody else having the skin beat off of them, to some degree, that would have been enough to cause you to not be in the same position. Because you think about it, these slave plantations were outnumbered probably by thousands. So why didn't they just, get a little nuck if you buck in their system? Because they were psychologically damaged. They were so psychologically damaged, they dare not do anything that's going to draw undue attention to them, or put themselves in danger, or put their babies in danger, or anything else. So that was a part of the psychological conditioning. That's the word. They were psychologically conditioned to not put themselves in harm's way. They were also raped. We know that the women that were on these plantations, they were used as, baby manufacturers, right? Because the more slaves that you had, the more money, the more lucrative. And being a female on a slave plantation, your job was to make babies and work. And so that they would then have, so you may be on a plantation, let's just say, you grow up and they allowed you to marry, maybe another slave. And so you would have babies with whoever it was that you were with. But we also know that the slave master would come in and have his way. And so that now introduced these light-skinned mixed babies who seem to have special privileges. And we would think that it was because of their fair skin and the texture of their hair. But we also know that it was because the slave master was related to him. So that was his son, that was his daughter. And so that now creates this inner slave rivalry, where we know that the lighter skinned slaves were typically those who would be in the house. And then the ones who weren't light skinned or didn't have a certain presentation, they were the ones that were field hands. They were the ones that were assigned maybe the more labor intensive and difficult jobs. So what does that look like present day? So we have a system where, we even hear about it now, where, the light skinned brothers versus the dark skinned brothers. And we have this mentality where, we'll say that if a woman is light skinned, oh, she's stuck up. She thinks she's all that. And then you have women who are darker skinned who struggle with being able to accept their darker skinned and loving it. Well, this stems from the slave plantation because there was a division based off of appearance. But again, at the root of that was that 9 times out of 10, that light-skinned slave was a seed, was a product of that slave owner. And so the women were raped. But then also too, it would be that if there weren't enough babies being produced, they would have them crossbreed. We don't talk a lot about that. So you may be forced to sleep with your daughter when she becomes a certain age, right? Can we just have a real conversation? Or they may require a brother and sister to sleep together if they were of the same age to produce babies. I think that they realized that it produced a subclass of people because of the not really pollination, but because of the crossing of the genes, the crossing of the DNA. And so I don't think that was a practice that lasted long. But then we're talking about transgenerational curses and where some of this stems from. Again, a lot of the things that the Black race experiences that seems to be, very taboo. It seems to be one of those things we don't talk about. We have to go back and figure out, well, where was that seed planted? And the seed was, in most cases, planted due to slavery. The other thing that would happen is that when a woman would have a baby, and so she may not be able to keep that baby if there was a need for this baby somewhere else. So the slave owner would then come and take that baby away from her and just sell it into slavery. And I'm a mama. I can't imagine me giving birth to one of my boys and somebody rolling up and be like, yeah, I'm gonna need that, and just take him. I don't have a voice. There's nothing that I can do about it, and I'm just supposed to be okay. And they expect you to continue to reproduce. So imagine the fear that is now instilled in this woman who her last child was taken and sold into slavery. And now she's required to reproduce again, knowing that the chances are very high that the same thing can now happen. So this is a generational trauma. And so now when we talk about the angry Black woman, where does she come from? Where does the angry Black woman come from? Because I don't think I've heard of the angry white woman. I mean, now we got Karens, but where does that idea that Black women are angry come from? Is there truth in it? Absolutely. There is absolute truth in the fact that there is a generation of Black women who are angry. But again, if we're going back to the trans and intergenerational traumas that their mothers experience and their mothers experience, then that anger is passed down from generation to generation. Because as a mother who's now birthing babies who are going to be taken and sold anyway, how do you now form an attachment? How do you learn to love them? How do you learn to care for them? And so we have women who are producing babies who can't connect with them. Does that sound familiar? And we see it even today. And you talk to a lot of Black women, unless there was a generational curse breaker and someone who decided to make a difference, you have lineages of Black women who never learned how to love. And it wasn't because they didn't have the capacity to, it was because they had to learn how not to in order to survive. Are you hearing me? And I hope that makes sense as to why some of the things that we see even today is a part of this post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that's a piece of it. So they had babies that were taken from them. Here's something that I learned. So y'all, I lived in Gainesville for 8 years. And when I lived there, and Gainesville is still, to my heart, but I'm in Dothan now, seeing about my dad. But what I learned is there is a history in Gainesville. And so if you've ever gone to a Gator football game, or if you've ever watched a Gator game, they have a thing where they chant Gator bait. Gator bait. And on the surface, it seems innocent. These are the Gators, and the opponent is the bait. That is not where that came from. I was having a conversation with a veteran one day. He was an older Black gentleman. This is when I first moved to Gainesville. And I was just asking him some questions about the area. I love history, and so I like to learn about the things that are part of a particular area. And so he begins to share this story with me about where the term gator bait comes from. And it stems back to the 1800s, where it was a time of slavery where they would take the babies of these slaves and use them for gator bait. Like they would dismember them. Whoo, y'all. They would dismember these babies and use them as lures to get the gators. In some cases, they would take a live baby and put it in some sort of like a crate or some sort of like a catching device to lure the gator in. And when the gator would come in and grab the baby, they would be somewhere watching, and it would be some sort of mechanism that would come down and capture the gator. We're talking about post traumatic slave syndrome. Your child is being used to feed a gator. So that lets us know that they didn't value, the slaves. They literally saw them as property. And so they treated them as such. And so we have to think about what that trauma did to a Black mother. What did that trauma do to a Black father? Here's another piece of information. So, men on the plantation, there was no such thing as, well, because you're married to this woman, we're going to respect whatever vows that you made, and you only have to sleep with her. No, if he was a stud and if he had attributes and features that they felt were popular, he may have been really big, really tall, really strong. No, they would force him to procreate with other females on the plantation. So, what does that do to a man who is now used to procreate? There is a song that was made, I believe it was in the 70s, where it talks about Papa was a Rolling Stone. Again, we look at these things, and I am in no way agreeing with them or saying they are right. My goal is to just help you understand where some of this is coming from, help you be able to have a perspective of when you see some of these things, you're able to make sense of it. Why is it that when you have more, and I'm not saying that it's not prominent in other races, but it is a pandemic in the Black race where you have men, Black men, who will lay down with the woman, get her pregnant, there's a baby born, and he has no attachment to it. He's an absent father. Why is that? Again, it goes back to during the times of slavery that they were not supposed to attach. Their job was to produce as many babies as possible. They just produced. And so, even if they wanted to maybe have an attachment and be a father, there was no way that they could, because that baby was not for them to have a family. That baby was a form of currency. That baby was now a form of property that that slave owner would not sell for a benefit and a profit. So again, just getting you to see where some of the mentalities that so many Black people still struggle with, where they come from. All right, so let's move down. So let's talk about 1863. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And there's a lot of debate about the Emancipation Proclamation and if Lincoln actually did this because he was concerned about slaves, or if Lincoln did this because it was an economic move, right? And so I think you can look at it from opposing standpoints. I'm not going to get real deep into that, but we know that for whatever reason, he instituted and declared the Emancipation Proclamation. And it said that all persons held as slaves with any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. Nonetheless, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, since it only applied to the areas of the Confederacy currently in a state of rebellion. Does that make sense? So he instituted the Emancipation Proclamation. And a lot of times we think that that ended slavery across the board. It didn't. It only applied to states in the Confederacy that were in active rebellion, and not even to the loyal border states that remained in the Union. So make that make sense. Why would he allow or require the states that were in active rebellion to no longer be able to have slaves? Now remember, slavery was productive. Like, it was very productive. Like, it was financially lucrative, right? So because these states are in rebellion, y'all can't have slaves anymore. So again, was it really about Lincoln caring about the slaves, or was it more of an economical move? Was it more of a way for him to get the attention of the Confederacy? Like, there can be a couple of different viewpoints that you can look at that. But again, this is just something to make you go, So the proclamation would have to be followed by a constitutional amendment in order to guarantee the abolishment of slavery. So we have the Emancipation Proclamation would declare that slavery would be ended in those Confederate states, but it had to be followed by an amendment that actually abolished slavery for good. So the 13th Amendment was passed at the end of the Civil War, before the Southern states had been restored to the Union, and should have easily passed in Congress. However, though the Senate passed it in April 1864, the House initially did not. At that point, Lincoln took an active role to ensure passage through Congress. He insisted that the passage of the 13th Amendment be added to the Republican Party platform for the upcoming 1864 presidential election. His efforts met with success when the House passed the bill in January 1865 with a vote of 119 to 65. On February 1st, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln approved the joint resolution of Congress, submitting the proposed amendment to the state legislators. The necessary number of states, 3/4, ratified it by December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that, here's where it gets good, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except, touch your neighbor and say except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, right? It was followed up by an amendment, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. But what did they just put in place? Slavery ended, but did it really? Because they replaced it. What did they replace it with? Dun, 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 the prison system. The prison system. Because you have to be convicted of a crime in order to be involuntarily held against your will. In order to now be a slave, you had to be convicted, right? Because the 13th Amendment in 1865 allowed for slavery and involuntary servitude, the South immediately created Black codes. Those codes criminalized recently freed Blacks by creating and selectively enforcing vagrancy, loitering, and curfew laws. They also created and selectively enforced laws that made it illegal for Blacks to refuse exploitative and abusive so-called jobs. So you telling me I'm gonna go to jail because I don't want that job? So it's like this: either you take this job, which is going to exploit you, probably going to be abusive, because remember, slavery just ended. The plantations then shut down because slavery ended. So my choice is to go back and work on this plantation, or you gonna throw me in jail and maybe work on a plantation anyway. Make that make sense? Does that make sense to you? But that is the system that was put in place. And if blacks violated any of those or similar black codes, they were sent to prisons that convicted. It was called convict leased. So you in prison, and it's like you're now leased out because of your crime, like as a way to pay off your debt. And this was 365, 24/7 labor on the same plantations and cotton fields and coal mines and railways they just been free from. So it's like, you set me free. I'm out minding my own business. And my choice is to go back to what I just came from, or go back to what I just came from. Right? So let's talk real quick about what exactly is PTSS, post traumatic slave syndrome. Hey, Trina. So, PTSS is a theory that explains the etiology of many of the adaptive survival behaviors in African American communities throughout the United States and the diaspora. It is a condition that exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants, resulting from centuries of chattel slavery, a form of slavery which was predicted on the belief that African Americans were inherently genetically inferior to whites. This was then followed by institutionalized racism, which continues to perpetuate injury, thus resulting in MAP, multi-generational trauma, together with continued oppression, absence of opportunity to heal or access the benefits available in the society, leading to post-traumatic slave syndrome. So let's think about that for a second. They didn't have the opportunity to heal. So we talked a little bit earlier about some of the experiences that those who were on these slave plantations endured. They didn't get set free, and now here's a go see a therapist card. There wasn't anything to help them heal. And that also goes back to why it is a known stigma in the black community when we talk about what happens in this house stays in this house. Because what happened during slavery in the house, who are you going to talk to about it? Who are you going to tell? And it created a people that does not trust the system. Because if the system is the one that is now inflicting the trauma, how do I now go and trust the same system? I can remember my grandmother, God rest her soul. My grandmother lived to be 99, and she's been gone now, maybe 3 years. And so I remember watching her when I was younger. And whenever we would go out in public, she never made eye contact with white people. She just didn't. And her grandmother was a slave. So I know that her growing up, she remembers some of her grandmother's experiences. And was even coached and told, you don't look at white people in the eye. You don't make eye contact. And it was instilled in her. And because of when she was born in the early 1900s. That was probably a part of her own experience, because it was still racism. You didn't make eye contact. So even now we're talking about 2000s, she didn't make eye contact because it was a part of her. And whenever she would see somebody, if somebody white spoke to her, it would be yes sir, no sir. She said it just like that. And I always wondered, like, why? And this is my younger stuff. I didn't have an understanding of, oh, that makes sense. And many of you have grandparents who probably carried themselves in the same manner, or they told you that they don't trust white people. And it's because of their experiences. And so, if you are now being raised by a generation of people who instill in you not to trust white people or not to trust different systems that are in place, that inherently becomes a part of who you are. And because those values have now been passed down to you, we pass down those same values to our children, right? And so that's where that transgenerational trauma creates. It's trauma that transcends across multiple generations. So it goes back to my first question that I asked you: how is it that we present day in 2024 are a product of post-traumatic slave syndrome when we weren't slaves? How are we impacted by that? Right? And that's where it comes from. And then it says that this is trauma that is passed down through generations, which I said is transgenerational trauma, sometimes referred to as ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma, and multi-generational trauma. The American Psychology Association explains that the effects of this kind of trauma are not only psychological, but familial, means family, social, cultural, neurobiological, and possibly even genetic. So you could be born with this predisposition and trauma, a way of thinking, a way of believing, a way of experiencing, a way of believing, because it's engrafted in your DNA. So if we look at it from a biblical perspective, this is the same thing as a generational curse. Could it be that many of the generational curses that the church talks about is actually generational trauma? I'll wait. Could it be that could it be that the generational curses that the church talks about, could that really be generational traumas? There could be one and the same, right? Because they show up the same. Whether it's a curse or whether it's trauma, we don't necessarily get to always pick it apart to identify the root of it. But the trauma that those ancestors experience because of the behaviors being perpetuated from generation to generation, maybe that's what creates the curse. Right? So if we go back to slave, right? They were in a situation that they had no control over. But we know that the rules don't necessarily care how they are applied. It's still a rule. So we have our slave descendants, right? Our great grandparents, maybe 4 generations back. They were forced to procreate with their daughters, their sisters, those who were in close relationship to them. And again, I'm not condoning any of this. I am getting you to understand why we see such a prevalence of the things that we see in the Black community. So again, that's my disclaimer. I'm not in agreement. I don't condone none of this. Just put your thinking cap on for a minute. I just need you to stay with me. So you have a Sorry, Siri thought I was talking to her. Sorry, y'all. So you have a great grandfather who was forced to sleep with his daughter because it's a slave. You just property. I don't care about that's your daughter. I need forced to sleep with his daughter, right? Or maybe he didn't even know it was his daughter because this child was taken from the mother at such a young age, and now they end up on the same plantation together, right? Because that's possible. He didn't even know it's his daughter. So either way, a father now sleeps with his daughter, right? So if he knows that's his daughter, that's traumatic for the daughter, but it's also traumatic for that father, right? But what does that do to his whole neuropsychology, knowing that you're being forced to sleep with something that you produced? So I imagine that there has to be a detachment from that individual, because either I do this or I'm gonna die or I'm gonna be beat or there's going to be a consequence. So if this is what is expected, now this behavior is passed down through the generations, right? But now slavery is no longer, we're free, but it's already been passed down. It's in your bloodline. Oh, that's good. It's now in the bloodline. So it doesn't matter that you are not the one that was a part of that traumatic experience. You don't know why you have this unnatural attraction to things you shouldn't be attracted to. You don't know why you now have this wanting and desire for things that are off limits, because it's now in your bloodline. And it's the same too, where for show, for entertainment, for whatever reason, they would have men sleep with men. And sometimes the slave master would also sleep with the male slaves, right? And so, again, in those times, we know that they didn't have a choice, but it's still in the DNA. It's still a part of that genealogy. So although it was, the root of it was trauma, it doesn't negate the fact that that trauma has now become a generational curse, because you can see it in the bloodline. You can look at anybody's family genealogy and you can identify the things that are in the bloodline. You can look at, we got a bunch of drunks in the family. There's a lot of sexual abuse in the family. The women don't stay married in the family. Women don't live past a certain age in the family. You can look at the patterns in your family and identify the post-traumatic stress that's in the genealogy, but you also can look at the curse that's still at work. What is the curse that's still at work in your family, but it stemmed from this slavery experience, right? But it's passed down. So whenever a person experiences trauma, no matter how big or small, there may be an emotional, mental, and physical impact. Potential symptoms are anxiety disorders, insomnia, and also PTSD, which we know is post-traumatic stress disorder. These expressions of trauma can be passed to a new generation through learned behaviors. You learn it from watching. You learn it because it was done to you. Again, you have a generation of mothers who don't know how to love their little Black children because they weren't loved. Nobody ever told them that they were beautiful because it wasn't done for them. At some point, we have to stop making excuses for the things that we do, get an understanding of why we do them, and choose to do better. We have to choose to do better. But again, a lot of the behaviors that we experience, they're learned, whether we observed it or we experienced it, and we continue to perpetuate the problem because we just continue to pass this down from generation to generation. So another thing is, under certain circumstances, sorry y'all, my dog. Under certain circumstances, there are some predictable patterns of behaviors that tend to occur. So here are the key patterns of behaviors. And the person that came up with this ideology is Dr. DeGruy. She is the person that coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, and she has a book about it. If you're interested in this type of stuff, I highly encourage you to look her out. A lot of the information that I'm sharing with you is from her, so I'm giving her full credit because this is not stuff that I sat down and wrote. but I will definitely give credit where credit is due. And Dr. DeGruy is the one that came up with this term, post traumatic slave syndrome. So she said that there is vacant esteem, insufficient development of what Dr. DeGruy refers to as primary esteem, along with feelings of hopelessness, depression, and general self destructive outlook. She explained that a common reaction from mothers is to denigrate their children when they receive compliments about them. DeGruy posts that this loving denigration was perhaps a strategy by enslaved mothers to downplay their children's strength so that the enslavers would not sell them. Enslaved mothers used appropriate adaptation to protect the lives of their children. So let's look at that for a moment. In that context, it makes sense. You know that the slave owner, you got your little 6-year-old, 7-year-old big enough to start working. And you know that in some capacity that, what's the word? He's very intelligent. He's very bright, whatever the case may be. And so now this information, you don't want the slave owner to come and take him. So you downplay him. Oh no, master. He's stupid. He ain't too bright. No, you don't want him. But the child is hearing this. The mother never comes back and says, well, I didn't mean what I said. I just said those things in an effort to keep the slave owner from getting you. Like that conversation was never had. So this little boy has heard from his mother that he's dumb, he's stupid, he's incapable, he's all of these things, but the mother did it out of protection. So if his mother did that, he now reproduces that same sort of talk and mentality to his own children, not realizing that the reason that his mother did that was for protection. And so you have, again, mothers, especially in the Black community, who will talk down to their children. Did we ever stop and ask ourselves, where did this come from? And so you have a prevalence of young Black children who do have low self-esteem, who don't think that they're capable because nobody is speaking life into them. All they ever hear is negativity. Then we put them in the system called school, who reinforces that same ideology that you're dumb, you're stupid, you can't learn. And so if they're getting this negative from both sides, who is now helping and educating them? But again, this is where it comes from. So there's also marked propensity for anger and violence, extreme feelings of suspension, perceived negative motivations of others. And we see that. We see the violence in the Black on Black community. We see again, I talked about the angry Black woman. Where does that persona come from? And so it's against self, property, and others, including the members of one's own group, i.e., friends, relatives, or acquaintances. So another ideology is racist socialization, internalized racism, learned helplessness, literacy deprivation, distorted self-concept, antipathy, or aversion for the following: the members of one's own identified cultural ethnic group. So I'm Black, but I don't like Black people, right? The mores and customs associated with one's own identified cultural ethnic heritage, the physical characteristics of one's own identified cultural ethnic group. So we can hate ourselves simply but because of how we look. And sometimes you hear that when you hear, I don't like, my wide nose, or, some women have really now becoming to where they embrace their natural hair. But I remember growing up, you had a perm, because most Black women hated the kinky texture of their hair, and it wasn't acceptable. If you wanted to go out and get a decent job, you couldn't show up with kinky hair. So you had to relax it or do certain things to it. And so now you have a generation that has embraced their natural hair. You're seeing a lot more sister locks. You're seeing a lot more of different just natural hairstyles, to the point that even where because of the Black race embracing these hairstyles. You've seen where people that are on the news, they've really had to fight to be able to wear natural hairstyles. Even in the military, there has been a push to allow, Black women to be able to wear natural hairstyles. And sometimes the styles that the military requires is not possible to have the bun, depending on what type of hair you have. It makes it a lot more difficult. So again, we're seeing kind of a swing of the pendulum where people are really embracing more of their ethnic identities and culture. So Dr. Monica Hinton said that Juneteenth is the day that all slaves were freed in the United States. On June 19th, 1865, Union soldiers entered Galveston, Texas, with news that the Civil War had ended and that the enslaved were free. This was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which is commonly cited again in history books as the end of slavery. So here are things that have been traumatizing and have left more transgenerational trauma in the Black community. The massacre of Black Wall Street was another historic event that caused enduring damage, both economically and psychologically, to the African American community. It remains the deadliest recorded act of racial aggression in the U.S. history. If you don't know much about Black Wall Street, I think it'd be really cool to just go and research it. Like, these people were very affluent and very wealthy. But of course, there was a group of people who didn't like the fact that they were rising to such wealth. So they went in and burned down the whole town. On June 1st, 1921, white residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma ignited 2 days of unparalleled racial violence against the town's prosperous African American community, following the accusation that a Black man had attempted to rape a white woman. The entire community was set on fire, leading to 300 deaths and 800 injuries, and thousands were left homeless. So again, this is 1921. So if all of these people were left homeless because others had come in and burnt down their communities, this puts the Black race at a disadvantage, right? So now you have these communities that are created because the Black people are displaced. And of course, they can't go out into the suburbs or in the common areas that are predominantly white and build communities. So they had to build their own communities. So what are the enduring impacts? So again, we talked about one of the biggest impacts is the post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how it has affected Black citizens even of today. And we know that another result is that some people avoid certain places, people, or activities and events that remind them of the individual or the traumatic experiences that their former ancestors may have endured. Of course, there's difficulty concentrating. So let's talk about that. We have a prevalence of our children, a lot of especially Black boys who can't pay attention. They have ADHD, ADD, and all of these other diagnoses. Again, could it be that some of the diagnoses and some of the symptomology that we are experiencing and seeing in even our children today, it still dates back to that post-traumatic slave syndrome, which doesn't just go away. It's engrafted in the DNA. So it may not even be that these children have a true ADD, ADHD, but we also know that children learn differently. And the way that a lot of the school systems are structured, it's not to teach our children. And I know I probably have some educators that will watch this after the fact, and I would love for you to, talk about that, how the educational system is not necessarily designed for us. Prime example. So my oldest son, Cameron, went through school, scholar. He was in the, what's that? He was in the Honor Society, A's and B's, just super intelligent, very intelligent. Went through high school. I think he graduated with 3.8, taking honors and advanced classes. Boy is smart. Well, in order to be considered for a scholarship, it's two parts. A part of it is your grades, right? But the other part is how well do you do on these standardized tests? he is not a standardized test taker. And many of you may have children who just don't do well on standardized tests. I didn't necessarily do well on standardized tests, but I did well academically. So you have a Black male who has busted his butt off through school, made exceptionally great grades, advanced classes. I mean, chemistry, trigonometry, trigonometry, trigonometry. He has done exceptionally well. He's taking the ACT. He's he scored okay, but could not score high enough to qualify for a scholarship. It was so damaging for him. It affected his self-esteem. It affected what he thought about himself, because here he is. I've done everything that I've been expected to do. And you're telling me that because I didn't make trigonometry, thank you, that because I didn't score well on this test, I'm not smart enough for a scholarship? Again, it's the system. And we see that there are Black and brown children who do well on standardized tests, but the majority don't. The majority don't do well on the ACT. The majority do not do well on standardized tests because it's not designed for them. So, how do we now prove to them, or how do we now build their self esteem to believe that they are equal, that they're capable, when they are participating in a system that proves them otherwise? Just one of the things that we have to consider. So, an aspect specific to PTSS is racial socialization and then internalized racism. And we see that today. You may have people that, anytime anything doesn't go well for them, they didn't get the job, whatever the case may be, it's always because, well, it's because I'm Black. And I think there may be some truth in some circumstances, but in some cases it's not. But it's because they have this internalized racism that's the lens that they see through. So every experience that they have stems back to racism in some capacity, right? And it makes it very difficult for them to be able to see things through a different lens. So another thing is that they may not also be able to trust in the systems. Again, my grandparents, great grandparents, they didn't go to the doctor because they didn't trust the doctors. And that's because there was an era where medical professionals were experimenting on Black people. So it created this distrust of the medical system. They would go in for a surgery and come out in the kidney missing and not even know like that they have these organs and different things are now gone. But it's a distrust of the system. There's a distrust of banks. My grandparents didn't keep money in the bank. When my grandmother passed away, my aunt was cleaning out some parts of the house. And I think she pulled out a drawer. And behind the drawer, there was this little weird compartment. And there was just money in there. It's not uncommon for even great grandparents. They don't put money in the bank. They'll put it in a jar, put it under a mattress. They'll cut a hole in the wall, put it behind a picture, because they don't trust the institutional systems that their ancestors have been a part of, again, that has taught them not to trust the systems. So again, talking about mental health. And that is the biggest piece that I think that makes all of this more difficult. And I'm going to kind of wrap up, is that because of the trauma, there are different ways that we as people are able to heal. But one of them is being able to have discussions like this and being able to talk about those experiences. And again, not necessarily slavery in itself, because none of us were a part of that system, but what are the implications and what are the symptomology that you have seen in your own genealogy that has been passed down from generation to generation? And then what do we do about it? The things that you have experienced personally as a Black or brown person. Sometimes we do need therapy. Sometimes we need to sit and talk about the things that we have experienced. Sometimes we need to sit down and talk to somebody who can help us look in the mirror and get us to realize that what I'm experiencing is internal. It is a perceived racism. It may not even be a racism that really exists, but because it's here, unless I change the way that I think, my cognitive processes, no matter what you say or do, I'm always going to look through the lens of trauma. And it makes things so much more difficult. So there is a piece where mental health becomes very important. And because again, mental health is stigmatized in the Black community, we don't go see therapists. We don't talk about our problems because what happens here stays here. But it would benefit you to be able to sit down and talk to somebody about your experiences to help move you forward. Many of us as a Black people, we get stuck because of our experiences and the experiences of the generations before us. We have an inability to move forward. And so, as a people, we become stuck. And then we develop this crabs in a bucket mentality where, because I'm not moving forward, I don't want you to move forward either. So, not only are we fighting with external forces, but now we're fighting within. There's a lot of infighting. And we see that every day, right? But we have to make a decision that, regardless of where any of it stems from, that we have to decide to have these open dialogues, these open discussions about post-traumatic slave syndrome, give it a name, identify it, and be able to come up with solutions. Because I don't know if you're paying attention, but these generations that are, I can't keep up with what they're called because I'm a millennial. I guess these Gen Zers and these alpha generation, y'all, we in trouble. We are in trouble. But it's because of what they are experiencing. I think it's the alpha generation and even the Gen Zers. They are witnessing George Floyd, right? They are growing up with these traumas that teach them you can't trust the police. Like, think about the things that they are seeing and experiencing as a younger generation. And so, if they are not getting healed, then they are going to create more generations that don't want to be a part. And a lot of them don't. A lot of them don't want to be a part of any sort of institutionalized structure. That's why many of them don't go to church. I attended a prayer summit yesterday, and Dr. Cora Jakes was there. When I tell you, she is phenomenal, but she talked about the generation that we have coming up and why we are losing them. And it's because of they don't want to be a part of the system. Because if my mom and my grandmother and all of these took a part of this system and they still struggling, my grandmama lived in Section 8. My mama lived in Section 8. I'm not living in Section 8. So they rebel and they buck against the systems, right? And I understand, but there still has to be a bridging of the gap so that the wisdom that our grandmothers passed down to us, it's not lost, because there are certain things that those generations had that we don't have. Those generations believed in family. Family may have been jacked up and maybe some stuff going on, but they believed in the institute of family. They believed in checking on each other. Like, there are just certain things that they believed in that they held on to that this younger generation, they don't care anything about that. Prime example, what was the last family reunion you went to? They don't have them anymore. Now, there are some families who do it, but I remember coming up, everybody had a family reunion. I didn't have a big family because so I was trying to go. During the summer, it was family reunions back to back to back. And some of y'all know what I'm talking about. You putting on a shirt, we going to the place, we rent out the event, we having a family reunion. But those family reunions were primarily held in place because of the patriarchs and the matriarchs who made sure those things happened. Even look at your holidays now. The holidays are not the holidays that they used to be, where we go to Big Mama house, we go to Granny house, we go to Nana house. We go and we attend these events because it was family. People stay at home during the holidays. So customs that had been passed down that had value, they're just not the same anymore. Right? So again, the whole purpose of this was just to have a Black history discussion because I thought this topic was just good. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. So what I need you to do, if you watch this on the replay, please comment. Let me know what you think. Just about this in general. Again, I am no expert. I pulled together some information to just create dialogue. Share this on your page. If it blessed you and you're like, man, that was good, share it. I am just sharing information. And if you would like to have more dialogues about anything, I'm gonna do better with coming live. I really am because I really enjoy teaching. I'm getting my life together. But anyway, for those of you that hopped on, thank you so much for listening to this discussion. Again, it's Black History Month. I thought this was a great topic. So thank you all for joining me on this Sunday evening. My dog is old and he makes noises, so I apologize. But all right, guys, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Bye.